Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me back. Today I'm going to build on a presentation that I did about many months ago, 6 months, maybe a year, and talk specifically about a measure that we've developed to look at childhood adversity, and particularly measure stressful experiences and traumatic stress symptoms in autistic youth. And I want to, of course, acknowledge my funders and present disclosures up on the screen right now. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and I am very privileged to teach, research, mentor, and actually raise my family on these grounds. So just to provide an overview of the talk, I think we see in the research in the community, there's really a growing interest in understanding how stressful and traumatic experiences affect autistic individuals. And when we think about how they affect them, there's an interest in PTSD, of course, its measurement, what might be leading to PTSD, but also broader than that, just kind of understanding how stressful and traumatic experiences might contribute to well-being and mental health in autistic children through adults overall. And I want to argue that our ability to kind of effectively engage with those questions, to answer those questions, will really be dependent on our ability to accurately measure what we mean by stressful and traumatic experiences and traumatic stress responses in the autistic population. So that's really been the impetus of my research program, which has worked for almost the last decade now, to kind of develop a measure to look that's called the Childhood Adversity and Social Stress Questionnaire, which is designed expressly to measure different types of stressful and traumatic experiences that might be particularly relevant for autistic youth, and also to get a more accurate view of traumatic stress symptoms in this population. And we've developed both parent and self-report versions of this questionnaire, but I'm going to be presenting data from the parent report today. And that's in part because the self-report, we've actually taken additional time to further refine the tool and test it. So that data is still coming in. So just to give a little bit of a background, build on kind of remind you of some of the things that I addressed in my prior talk, to let you know kind of where we're coming from on this issue. Childhood adversity. So how do we define this? Why do we care about this? Adverse childhood experiences often considered to include things like maltreatment, which is physical, sexual, and emotional abuse and neglect, but also community violence, financial instability, and exposure to parent mental health problems, substance abuse, domestic violence, divorce, and incarceration. These kinds of adverse childhood experiences have been demonstrated to, number one, be fairly common. So in a number of studies, you'll see that adults looking back on their life actually self-report the majority that they have had at least one of these adverse experiences, and around 25% will report 3 or more. Also important, study after study now has demonstrated a consistent relationship between the amount of childhood adversity that people experience and their mental and physical health outcomes. And importantly, that relationship to poor mental and physical health outcomes has been demonstrated both prospectively and retrospectively. So what that means is, while initially some of the studies were asking adults to reflect back on their life and recall different adverse childhood experiences kind of retrospectively, we also now see studies that follow children as they develop, showing the same relationship. So showing that these relationships aren't just due, for example, to people with mental health problems being more likely to just remember or recall stressful events than people without. Amongst all this adversity, it might be important, though, to think a little bit also about how we define what is actually a trauma. So not all adversity actually constitutes trauma, because trauma can have a very specific meaning. It actually can mean different things depending on who you're talking to. And in the literature, I'd like to discuss 2 main definitions that I think have relevance to the talk today. One way of defining trauma or traumatic event is actually laid out by the DSM, so our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Diagnosing Psychological Conditions. So in the DSM, in PTSD criteria, there's something called Criterion A, which is a definition of what the triggering traumatic event must be in order for you to diagnose PTSD. And within this criteria, trauma is defined as exposure to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or sexual violence. It can be both direct or indirect, so somebody exposed to or witnessing it can also count as a trauma. So that's kind of the DSM PTSD criterion A definition of trauma. But another way to think about trauma, sometimes referred to as little t trauma, or thinking about kind of stressful experience, is something that's been laid out by SAMHSA. And this is thinking about any event, series of events, or set of circumstances that are really experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening with lasting adverse impacts. So this is saying it doesn't have to be death or threatened death. Any kind of event or series of event or experiences that are actually resulting in long-term psychological injury, we could potentially think about as having a traumatic impact, little t trauma. And a nice way to think about this is there might be kind of 3 steps in the process, 3 phases that we should be interested in if we're doing research on this topic. One is understanding that there's a broad array of adversities that people can be exposed to, a small subset of which are criterion A events. But many adversities or childhood adversities, stressful experiences that kids can experience will not necessarily fall into the criterion A category. Then it's also true that in order to think about trauma, we're not just talking about what happened to you, but how the individual appraised what happened and how it affected them. And finally, when we're thinking about traumatic responses, we think about PTSD, but for a larger number of people, they may not meet criteria for PTSD, but may have other features of traumatic stress symptoms that just don't meet full criteria. And for many other individuals, really the effects of trauma might be broader physical and mental health conditions, not only PTSD. So PTSD is not the only outcome that can result from a traumatic experience or stressful experiences. Just to break this down a little bit further, show you some data to support these ways of thinking. We do know that the more childhood adversities, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs that you experience, the more likely you are to have mental and physical health conditions over time. And what you'll see on the side of the screen here is called the ACEs pyramid, which really shows how adverse experiences contribute to neurodevelopment, which can in turn contribute to mental and physical health conditions, and in some scenarios, early death. Despite all this adversity, we also know that if you're looking at an adolescent population in the US, only 5% of adolescents end up with a diagnosis of PTSD in their lifetime. It is also true that the minority of people who are exposed or children exposed to a criterion A, so big T trauma, only 16% will go on to develop PTSD. So not everyone who's exposed to criterion A traumas actually goes on to develop PTSD. It's only a minority. It is true, however, that children exposed to criterion A traumas, big T traumas, many of them may not develop PTSD, but they may develop things like anxiety and depression, so broader mental health impacts. And it is also true that children exposed to low magnitude or stressors, so both extreme and low magnitude stressors, so things not just criterion A, things outside of criterion A, can actually be associated with traumatic stress symptoms in the general population. Interestingly, even though we know that children on the spectrum have increased rates of most mental health conditions, and even though we know that adverse childhood experiences are a significant risk factor or predictor of mental health, research on autism has really been focused on just the top half of this pyramid, almost forgetting the bottom. And so there's a real impetus, I think, for autism researchers and all of those who work with individuals on the spectrum to not just think about genetics or features of autism that may put children at risk for developing anxiety and depression that are associated with autism, but also thinking about the experiences that children on the spectrum have that may interact with their neurodevelopment in increasing that risk. So it's really time to dig a bit deeper and go just beyond focusing on the individual child to thinking about that child within their context, excuse me. And just to hammer home this point a little bit more and give you some things to chew on, again, until recently, the role of childhood adversities play in the prevalence of mental health conditions observed in autistic children has really been understudied. We are seeing an increased focus on this in recent years. Interestingly, in contrast to most other mental health conditions, research does not consistently point to an increased prevalence of PTSD in autistic children. And this is really interesting, right? Because data really consistently supports that children on the spectrum are at increased risk for many other mental health conditions. Data suggests that adults on the spectrum do show increased rates of traumatic stress symptoms based on self-report questionnaires. And we know that autism is associated with many risk factors, known risk factors for PTSD, including an increased exposure to adverse childhood experiences. Autism is associated with increased exposure to adverse childhood experiences, but also autism is also associated with having anxiety disorders, intellectual disability, and social disconnection. All of these things are risk factors for the development of PTSD. So it's quite curious that despite all of these risk factors, we don't necessarily see in research an increased rate of PTSD being diagnosed in children on the spectrum. And notably, we see this even in children with maltreatment histories. So this is a very interesting study done by Brenner in 2018. They were looking at 350 youth in the autism inpatient collection study. So these are children on the spectrum who are in inpatient care, often due to having quite significant needs, often mental health related concerns. So they're particularly at-risk population where we might expect to see more adversity and potentially more traumatic stress. 28% of children in this study did have a maltreatment history. So there was some history of abuse. And yet only 2.6% had a diagnosis of PTSD, which is again, much lower than we would expect given that maltreatment history. Also notably, Brenner reported many increased traumatic stress symptoms in many of these children with maltreatment histories, even though they weren't ultimately given the diagnosis. So one possibility for why we don't see increased rates for PTSD in children on the spectrum is that potentially there are strengths, potentially they are protective, maybe there is truly a reduced risk, and that is something we should consider. But another thing we can consider is that maybe we're just not measuring it correctly, or maybe the criteria we have aren't sensitive enough, or there are challenges to assessing PTSD in kids on the spectrum that are really preventing us from accurately estimating how many kids are actually impacted. So now's the time to take a moment to think about why is assessing PTSD within the context of autism so complex? So one of the first questions that might be relevant for this population is, again, what really counts as a traumatic event? In order to get a diagnosis of PTSD, you need to have been exposed to a criterion A event as defined by the DSM. But it's very possible that kids on the spectrum are actually experiencing traumatic stress symptoms in response to a broader array of events than just those criterion A experiences. And remember that we see even in the general population that that does happen for kids off the spectrum, that you can have traumatic stress symptoms resulting from things that don't technically meet the criterion A criteria. So in our studies to think about this, think about what are really the broad array of stressful and potentially traumatic experiences that might be impacting kids on the spectrum. Do we have to broaden our view of the types of things that might actually be traumatic? You'll see a study that we did that I presented last time was a qualitative study where we asked autistic individuals and their parents to tell us what they thought were kind of sources of trauma. But you also see this supported, and I have the references on the bottom, in some additional studies at this point, qualitative and quantitative. So what some of this research has told us is that in addition to those classic maltreatment, criterion A, traditional, potentially traumatic events, we do need to think more broadly potentially for kids on the the spectrum across two key categories. One is thinking about kind of chronic or extreme stressors related to social exclusion that could potentially have a traumatic effect. This is bullying, social isolation and alienation, interpersonal betrayal, often resulting from children on the spectrum having a very literal interpretation of what's said to them. So somebody told me something, which they might have meant just colloquially or to be polite, and then they didn't follow through on their word. And now I feel that I can't trust people. So in our qualitative study where we tried to explore what do autistic people view as potential sources of trauma, so long-term lasting, things that cause lasting psychological injury, this came up a fair amount. You also see that we might need to consider things like stigma and discrimination. And other things that came up in these interviews were traumatic experiences related to being physically restrained or sedated, and also potentially the chronic grating stress of feeling like you don't have the same choices as others, the same opportunities, or even that your autonomy has been taken away. So based on kind of mixed method research with autistic individuals and their caregivers, these different types of social exclusion stressors came up as potentially very prominent things we might want to ask about if we truly want to understand what might be sources of stress and trauma for autistic individuals in more quantitative research. The other area that kind of came up is something we call traumatic incongruities, which is extreme stress or chronic stress that parents and individuals on the spectrum attribute to a lot of poor well-being, having to do with extreme hypersensitivity, traumatic kind of grading, stress related to changes and transitions, and also just the chronic stress of having trouble reading social situations, not knowing what to expect from social situations, and feeling kind of chronically overwhelmed or kind of left out in those social situations because you're having trouble reading social cues. So when we ask autistic people, what are these sources of stress and trauma, here are some of the other domains that kind of come up as potentially relevant from those interviews. Another thing we need to think about when we say, why is assessing PTSD with autism potentially so complex? Why might the criteria as written, maybe not be as sensitive as we need them to, is thinking about, how well do PTSD criteria actually capture the traumatic reactions of autistic children? And here, there's a few things to consider. Number one are developmental considerations. And there's a history here in that there's been a really strong body of work done by Michael Scheringa and colleagues to actually demonstrate that the criteria for PTSD as they were originally written were not sensitive enough to capture PTSD in young children, in children under 6. And that's because of developmental differences in how traumatic reactions, traumatic stress may manifest in younger children. Through series of research, Scheringa was able to demonstrate that there was a kind of different array, many shared symptoms, but maybe not as many symptoms, some different expressions of certain traumatic stress symptoms that you really needed to think about in order to more accurately capture PTSD in young children. Because of their developmental level, some of the original PTSD criteria as written were almost impossible to assess in very young children, right? And this might be very relevant for when we think about how do you assess PTSD in individuals with autism whose developmental might be quite discrepant from their chronological age and whose developmental skills are often quite splintered, right? So whose verbal ability might be notably impacted, getting in the way of really being able to clearly establish symptoms being associated with a traumatic experience, but also to kind of get in their heads and understand exactly what they're experiencing. If they're avoiding something because they're having a horrible memory or it is triggering to them because it's related to a trauma. These are all barriers when kids can't speak to us. They prevent us from being able to really nail down certain PTSD symptoms, and they can make assessing for this diagnosis and feeling confident about giving it really, really challenging. The other thing we have to think about is that there's actually behavioral overlap between many features of PTSD and things that are associated with autism or even a core part of autism. So for example, many PTSD symptoms have to do with arousal dysregulation, trouble sleeping, trouble paying attention, irritability, emotional outbursts. Many children of the spectrum will have those features with or without having a traumatic experience in their history. So I think it can be really challenging for clinicians sometimes when they see those behaviors to feel confident that that is a sign of a traumatic event has taken place or this is a traumatic stress reaction. Similarly, another feature of PTSD can be withdrawing oneself socially, becoming more and more disengaged. That may be a core feature of autism for some individuals, again, making it really challenging for clinicians to feel confident about what's the PTSD, what's the autism. And I think I've heard a lot of parents say this as well. And finally, another thing that kind of comes up is that the possibility that traumatic stress is actually being represented in a distinct way in autistic children. So there might be distinct kind of behaviors that we really need to pay attention to, things like regression and self-injury that might be indicative of a traumatic response in an autistic child, which would be, but you may not see in another child, but maybe they're particularly telling in this population. Though again, some of those features can also occur in autism, whether or not there's a traumatic history. So these are just laying out some of the complexity and why we have to be quite careful actually in thinking about how to assess this construct of traumatic stress within the context of autism. There's both possibility for autism to diagnostically overshadow PTSD. So for true symptoms of traumatic stress, not to be counted because they're just being attributed to autism. But there's also the potential to overpathologize children on the spectrum. If we look at some of those features and say, oh, there must be trauma because there is self-injury, that may not be the case. So just to kind of put this all together, in 2015, we did a review on this topic and we put forward a theoretical model. And we basically said that when you think about these different phases of adversity and how adversity then transforms into what is considered a traumatic event and what the effects of trauma can be, which include but are not limited to PTSD. We basically argued that when you're thinking about this within the context of autism, you have to think about how autism might really moderate each phase. So autism might change the rate of adversities that children are exposed to, and it might also change the type of adversities that they're exposed to. Autism may moderate how kids experience those different types of adversities and which ones are really going to have that lasting psychological effect and be perceived as quite distressing. Meaning that an experience that might be just a day-to-day stressor for some individuals could potentially have a more profound impact on somebody on the spectrum in some cases. And finally, autism might also influence kind of what the traumatic reaction looks like, how PTSD is expressed, but also the likelihood of having longer-term psychological impacts and what those psychological impacts look like. Oh, and sorry, the green boxes here are the studies that we've conducted that help support this notion of autism really interacting with each phase of the process. So those are all the issues. And hopefully thinking about those issues, you're in agreement with me that this is the reason why we should have a measure that is more tailored to the autistic population, that will let us in a more detailed, tailored way, really assess the traumatic and stressful experiences that are going to matter for autistic people and for children, and with greater precision, try and get at traumatic stress reactions when they're there. Okay. So to do that, we developed the Childhood Adversity and Social Stress Questionnaire, which we're calling the CASSQ. We did this using a mixed method approach that was informed by the Patient-Reported Outcomes Measurement Information System, or the PROMIS system guidelines. This was something put out by the US NIH to really guide measurement development to be very person-informed, so almost co-developed with individuals that we're hoping to gather this information from the beginning. And there are many stages to thinking about how to develop the items and test them, a number of which we employed in developing this measure. And specifically, the steps that we took to figure out what were the items we initially wanted to include in the measure, both in terms of stressful experiences and potential traumatic stress symptoms. We did a literature review. We did the qualitative study, which I referenced before, which asked autistic adults and caregivers to tell us about what they thought might be sources of trauma in their lives that maybe we should include in a measure like this. And we also, for just thinking about traumatic stress symptoms, did an expert Delphi poll where we talked to experts in childhood trauma and also autism, many of whom had expertise in both, about what do you think are really the strongest indicators of a traumatic stress reaction in a child on the spectrum? What are the ones that you feel most confident about would kind of tell you that PTSD might be present or that the child is having a traumatic reaction? So we used all of this kind of mixed method work to inform a broader array of items put into the general pool to develop the CASSQ. So a broader range of potential stressors that could impact autistic children, and in some ways a more nuanced or tailored version of traumatic stress symptoms that would help us get at traumatic stress subscale in these individuals. We then put those items and our first draft of the measure through expert and parent review, and we came up with a final CASSQ measure, which I'll talk to you about in detail, which includes both an adversity list, which everybody completes, and also a traumatic stress subscale, which is completed just by those individuals or parents of individuals who are noting that a very, very stressful experience happened that is continuing to bother the child. So those who may have a potentially traumatic event. And notably, again, I'm just going to be talking about the parent report version of the CASSQ today, but there is a self-report version that we're also working on, which is going through this further development and testing. Specifically, we've done a cognitive interviewing approach on the self-report, which means that we've taken the measure and had teens on the spectrum and their parents, teens through young adults, excuse me, kind of go through it and read each question out loud, tell us what they think it means, give us feedback on it, give us feedback on the response options, and also tell us if there's anything that they think should be in the measure that's not there. And we did that particularly to make sure that the self-report version will be more user-friendly for verbal autistic teens through young adults who might be using it. And I'll say this first version of the measure is focused on children through young adults. That's kind of the age range we focused on. And we tested it initially in children with at least phrase speech as a starting point. We developed the items, so we're hopeful that they will also be usable for kids who have more significant language impairments. But just for this first psychometric evaluation of the measure, we did want to try it in a population that at least had some ability to kind of articulate their needs and experiences. So that's the initial population we've tested it in. So to tell you a little bit more about what it looks like, the CASSQ includes an initial query for the trauma. Has anything happened to your child that made them feel very stressed or about which they're very upset for more than a few weeks? And if they say yes to that question, we ask, does your child still feel very upset or bothered by that experience now? If they say yes, then they're going to complete the traumatic stress symptom subscale, which has 24 items in it. And the responses were chose from the PROMIS rating scale system, so response sets that have been validated in prior studies. 21 of those 24 items are about potential traumatic reactions, and there's 3 about just general functioning. That's only completed by parents who are reporting that their child has a very significant stressor in the past and it's continuing to bother them now. So the ones within whom we want to see if there might be traumatic stress symptoms currently. What the symptoms include are a lot of DSM, PTSD criteria. However, based on that Delphi study with experts, there are a few additional items that were added to make this more sensitive for autistic children. Specifically, we ask about suicidality, regression of skills, increased reliance and reassurance seeking from the caregiver, and more repetitive self-injury or non-suicidal self-injury. Because these were items that experts really thought, if they're present in relation to a stressful experience, might be sign of traumatic stress reaction. We also removed some PTSD criteria that the experts really thought were going to be too hard to assess or maybe just not specific enough to be useful. And this included traumatic memory loss, having blunted affect, or being more likely to blame themselves, and also some features of dissociation. So the measure does not ask about these specific symptoms of PTSD because of the expert opinion that they were going to be too complex or potentially not that useful or telling in this population. Each item also really focuses on a change in functioning. So when we ask about sleep disturbance, it's not, has your child ever had trouble sleeping, or does your child have trouble sleeping? Are they having increased trouble sleeping, pay attention, increased irritability, etc., since the traumatic experience? So it's really showing that there's a change in functioning, not just asking if that's a problem in general. And then finally, the items are really focused on observable behaviors as much as possible, knowing that it's hard for some autistic children to really articulate their internal experiences. For everyone, so even those who don't endorse a current stressful experience, everyone are then asked to report on 20 different adversity items, 13 of which are pretty traditionally assessed adversities like the adverse childhood experiences, but 7 of which are really autism-indicated adversities focused on things like social exclusion and these traumatic incongruities. And for every adversity that's endorsed, we also ask parents to tell us about first and last occurrence of the adversity, the chronicity, so how often did it happen, and did it seem to have a distressing impact on your child? Okay, so I want to jump into the data and then make sure we have some time for questions at the end. So this is some of our initial data on the parent report measure. And the goal of the study was really to describe the frequency and the characteristics of these different types of adversities assessed on the CASSQ in a community sample of autistic youth or parents of autistic youth. And then we also wanted to use the sample to really look at the construct, convergent, and discriminant validity of the CASSQ traumatic stress symptom scale. And what that means is we wanted to assess the extent to which this symptom subscale seems to be reflecting DSM, PTSD criteria, or PTSD criteria in general. And also, does it seem to align with other measures of PTSD, but not align as strongly with measures of other types of mental health problems, suggesting that it's actually able to discriminate a bit, for example, between a traumatic stress reaction and just anxiety problems or behavior problems or externalizing problems or sensory sensitivities, for example. Is it able to just try and be more specifically focused on traumatic stress reactions? These are some of the metrics we look at to try and support the use of a measure. Okay. The sample was collected from the Interactive Autism Network. And this is parents of children on the spectrum, all of whom have a community diagnosis, which had been validated by the EN network. And we did require children to have at least meaningful phrase speech. The majority had complex speech, but there was a notable minority who also just had phrase speech. Oh, there's an error on this slide. Our sample for the traumatic stress symptoms was 298, but in terms of the adversity, it's actually over 700. The age range of the sample is 8 to 17 years. It was predominantly male, white, higher education, and 82% had that meaningful fluent speech. So about 18% with just phrase speech. This is just an overview of the procedures. In the end, again, in terms of everybody who completed the CASSQ, we had 729, 298 of which the parents reported that there was some kind of stressful experience that was very distressing to the child at the time and which was continuing to bother them, which then triggered us asking them about traumatic stress symptoms. So we have a smaller sample within whom to evaluate those traumatic stress symptoms and that subscale. In addition to the CASSQ, Parents filled out another traditional measure of child PTSD, the CPSS, and we also asked them to fill out the short sensory profile and the child behavior checklist, which is a broadband measure of just mental health concerns. And again, we were asking them for those measures for us to look at, does our measure of traumatic stress at least seem to align with some other measures of traumatic stress that may be imperfect, but at least showing us some convergence? And is it differentiating from other concerns that we might see in autism that may or may not be related to traumatic stress? Okay, the next few slides are going to be a lot of numbers, but I'm going to try and guide you through what I think are kind of the key points. So what this slide is showing you, let me put myself here, is the frequencies endorsed by parents of these different types of adversities. And what you'll see is these are our standard adversities in gray, 1 through 13, and items 14 to 20 were the items that were specifically included because they were kind of autism nominated. So these were the items that were developed based on our qualitative interviews with autistic individuals and that literature review of what might be relevant stressors for autistic individuals. So the take-home points here are the most common adversities endorsed, and also the most common distressing adversities are highlighted in blue. And they included bullying, death of a loved one, but also many of these autism-related adversities. So being extremely distressed by the look, sound, or feel of things, down to, made to feel like you don't belong, so stigma and discrimination, being extremely distressed by changes, and also this kind of chronic stress related to social confusion. So these were the ones that parents were most likely to say, yes, this happened. And also when you looked at what were the things that parents said, yes, it happened and it was distressing, because the base rates of these things, their exposure is just greater, they also tended to be the most distressing kind of events that the children had experienced. You can also see in orange that there are some of these items that parents didn't always feel like they could answer. So parents, over 10% of parents were likely to say, like, I just don't know if the child had been bullied, if they had been exposed to violence in their neighborhood, or if they'd experienced stigma or discrimination. Okay. And you can also see from this list that though they're not the most prevalent events in this sample, we did have parents reporting sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect in this sample as well. So there were a number of criterion A traumas in addition to this broad array. Okay. Now, when we dig into these adversities and we look at when they're endorsed, kind of what are their characteristics, what this slide is showing us is on the very, I think this is the right-hand side, hopefully for you, the orange and yellow that you see highlighted. This is what we're calling the relative impact column. So what these percentages are showing you is when somebody said that bullying happened to their child, what percentage of those people also said that that bullying had a really negative impact on the child. It was very distressing to them at the time. It lasted for more than a few weeks, the impact. And what this is showing you in orange and kind of the yellow is that these are the adversities that had kind of the biggest relative impact. So when they happened, they tended to have a distressing impact on the child per the parents' report. And what you can see is bullying, neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, but also loss of autonomy and marginalizations and interpersonal betrayal. All of these, over 50% of the people who said this happened to my child also thought that when it happened, it had a really lasting negative impact on their child. And you can see that for emotional abuse, separation from a loved one, exposure to domestic violence, but also stigma, stress in response to changes, and this stress related to social confusion. These also were pretty high in that 40 to 50% of parents, when they said that happened to their child, they also thought it had a lasting negative impact. What's notable about this is that it shows you that there's a difference between the most prevalent adversities that kids experience and the relative impact of those adversities. So one way to illustrate this is that extreme sensory sensitivity, the vast majority, over 60% of parents in the sample did say, like, that's something for my child on the spectrum. They do have intense reactions to sensory experiences that seem to be adverse to them. But only a third of parents who said, yes, that's happened to my child, actually thought that those things had a lasting long-term impact on their child, these sensory experiences. And that's in contrast to something like sexual abuse, which 70% of the time when a parent said that happened, they said it was also associated with a long-term lasting negative impact. Also just want to note that the more stressful experiences that were reported on the measure, the more mental health symptoms were also reported, the more PTSD symptoms were reported, and more adversity was associated with lower income for families. Both traditional and these autism-nominated adversities were independently associated with more mental health concerns, suggesting that these additional items are helping to explain some of the variance in mental health for autistic individuals. And interestingly, having complex speech was actually associated with having parents being more likely to endorse traditional and kind of social exclusion adversities, but that wasn't the case for traumatic incongruities. That may be because some of these traditional and social exclusion adversities, they're just harder to detect in kids who don't have as much language. I also want to note that when we're thinking about these different types of adversities, it's often important not to just think about one adversity, but more about how these different types of stressors may be clustered together. So what this is showing you is a latent class analysis, which is basically showing you that there seem to be almost 3 profiles of adversity kind of histories in the sample. One of which, in this light blue, we called low-level adversity. This is about 45% of the sample. And what you can see for these kids is that in general, their parents are not reporting a lot of different adversities. When they do, what they're reporting are these things maybe more related to autism. So having these chronic stress related to changes in daily life or sensory experiences. So, but overall, a low profile of adversity. And you can see that here. So these are items that are associated with traumatic incongruities. And you can see for this bottom group, those are really the only ones that are elevated for them, maybe a slight increase for death of a family member, which is a more common experience in the population in general. Not the autistic population, general population. The next group that we see is what we call the moderate adversity and particularly social adversity group. And that's in this darker blue color here. And what you can see for them is that in general, parents seem to be reporting more adversity than in our low group, but there's a particular uptick for this group as well in this stigma, bullying, emotional abuse, so different forms of kind of social adversity, particularly for this group. So this is a peak for this group. They have more adversities in general, but the particular types of adversity that really seem to stand out for them as well are within this social exclusion domain. And notably, that's 47% of the sample. So that was the biggest group in the sample. And then finally, our last group we were kind of thinking about as the complex trauma group, in that they really seem to be elevated in almost every type of adversity. And it's in this group that you also see reports of physical abuse, exposure to community violence, domestic violence, and also potentially suicide and mental health problems in the family being endorsed. So they have the social exclusion, they have autistic incongruities as stressor, and they have these more classic forms of maltreatment being endorsed. So really a complex trauma kind of profile. Okay, a little bit on the traumatic stress symptoms subscale, and then a brief summary and we can get to questions. So we looked at how is this traumatic stress symptom subscale performing in the 298 subsample that endorsed that something distressing had happened to their child. And you can see in this sample, again, these are the types of adversities that were more common. They are the same types of adversities that you saw in the general sample, but notably, whereas the mean level of adversity was around 3 for our folks who weren't endorsing any current traumatic stress symptoms, for this potential trauma sample, the mean is closer to 6. So in general, parents are reporting a lot more adversity in the sample than in the sample that didn't say that there were any current traumatic reactions. And notably, 90% of this sample had some kind of traditional stressor, so 1 through 13 endorsed, and about 15% had something that would probably qualify as a criterion A event, in addition to many of these autism-related stressors. Okay, this is a very busy slide, and we're running out of time. So I'm just going to give you the take-home message. This is showing you all the items that we asked about on the traumatic stress subscale. And basically where we landed with this is that it does seem to generally fit PTSD criteria with some variations. So particularly things like being more tense and on edge, more angry and aggressive, sadder since the experience, those things seem to be more related to types of negative alterations in cognition and mood. So things like trouble focusing, talking less, than reactivity in this autistic sample. For kids on the spectrum, the reactivity kind of criterion for PTSD, it's one of the features of PTSD. On this measure, it seems to be better reflected by, honestly, self-injury, suicidality, and trouble sleeping. So it's almost kind of like an elevated reactivity in this group. And many of these other symptoms relating to tension, anger, emotion dysregulation, but also social disinterest, changes in mood, those are all kind of clustering together. And that's a slight variation on how things kind of usually might fall out in a PTSD model. So you're seeing many of the same PTSD criterion, but they're just clustering together in a slightly different way. We did still see symptoms of intrusion clustering together and also avoidance clustering together in this model. So we thought it was a good example of construct validity. In general, we seem to be measuring PTSD in these domains of PTSD that we want to in an autistic group. And we also did see evidence for convergent and discriminant validity. And what you see here is that the relationship between this traumatic stress subscale and other measures of PTSD, that is the strongest relationship. And it's significantly stronger than you'll see the relationship with sensory symptoms, externalizing, or rule-breaking behavior in kids on the spectrum. But it is also true that the more traumatic stress symptoms you have, these kids on the spectrum also, when they have more traumatic stress symptoms, do seem to have more sensory symptoms, more externalizing. It's just not as strong as relationship as like another measure of PTSD. So it's not that these constructs aren't related, it's just that they're not as strongly as related as two measures of PTSD. So it provides support for the idea that we really are getting at PTSD here. Okay, discussion. I really have to wrap up. In general, our findings are providing initial support for the validity of this measure. And I think the key take-home points here are that the work that we put into trying to tailor the types of adversities we ask about, the way that we ask about the traumatic stress symptoms, I think it has paid off. We can see that some of these autism-nominated adversities that we put on this subscale are the ones that are most likely to be endorsed, and a subset of them seem to also have a really significant lasting impact. So you can see the relevance of asking about these questions for this population. We also saw good support for our ability to measure traumatic stress symptoms using this more tailored approach. And another key take-home is just bullying was the most common detrimental adversity endorsed in this group, which I think is something really important to kind of hang on to. There are limitations. The study was majority white, male, and its community sample of verbally communicative autistic youth. So we're going to need to look at more diverse populations, and particularly populations where rates of classic forms of maltreatment might be even more heightened than we saw here. This is parent report, which means we could be missing a lot. But parent report might also be a very important perspective for some kids on the spectrum. And really what we want to try and do is triangulate parent and self-reports whenever we can to get as close to the truth as possible. And then finally, I want to note that some of these autism-indicated stressors, they're a good example of where it's really hard to draw a line between the stressful experience and the stressful response. They're a good example of that middle phase. where we're not just measuring an event that occurred, because the event that occurred often is just social interaction or change in life. We're starting by asking about, did your child have a stressful response? And then from that stressful response, seeing if there's then a relationship to later long-term lasting psychological distress and traumatic stress symptoms. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, future directions, more diverse samples, looking at if this is really going to help us give a PTSD diagnosis, that self-report CASSQ, and thinking about how these different clusters of different adversity types might really be predictive of development for kids on the spectrum. And now I'll take questions.
Right. Well, we just have time for a couple of questions because, well, we have 6 minutes, so we can squeeze a few in. I just wanted to read, there was a really interesting ongoing thread going on between different adults on the spectrum who can really relate to the experiences of the people in your studies. I'll read this one from Martha. It says, many autistic adults were severely traumatized by years of bullying at school, in the family, and even at work. I am always interested in strategies that are recommended for healing from that trauma and overcoming the resulting self-loathing and crushed spirit that prevents us from living up to our full potential. So I want to acknowledge that there's been this very rich thread going on with all these individuals, and that they are sharing and helping with links. So if people aren't looking at the Q&A, be sure to check in there. A few questions that I think are related. Many of the questions we got were about strategies, like that one. So for people who are seeking different trauma, like strategies for addressing trauma, do you have just some general recommendations or thoughts, or how would you refer out somebody you knew if a friend asked you, what should I do?
Yeah, okay, so this is tricky because the research is not about treatment yet, but
Yes.
I think like my main goal with this line of research and this first step is validation and recognition. And I think that is a critical first step in the healing process, right? In terms of what the treatment looks like, a lot of the strategies that we used to, for example, support anxiety, depression, mental health, are also very similar to the strategies you might use to support somebody who's experiencing traumatic stress. The key difference is if you're processing the trauma or not. And if you are having these experiences of intrusion, of avoiding things because they specifically remind you of the trauma, and you need to focus on that in order to kind of reformulate what that experience was like for you and move from this place of feeling like I'm damaged to instead, I've survived. This is what I've learned from this experience. This is how I can recognize this was not my fault. All of those things. And so I think that is where thinking about some of these experiences as truly traumas and being able to talk to a clinician about, I need to process this and I need to work through these types of experiences, not just deal with emotion regulation strategies, although those are also really important. Because they're often the first step in a trauma treatment. So before we go after these traumatic memories in treatment, we often need to work on emotion regulation strategies, understanding emotion, being able to understand different levels of it and what to do to kind of calm yourself down. Because when you re-engage with traumatic memories, often it can be quite disruptive. And you want to make sure that you have some of those strategies so you can gradually and in a safe way kind of re-engage with the memories and address them. So that's what I would kind of describe as a trauma-informed perspective and a way to try and talk to a clinician about, this is the type of support that I want and need. I want those strategies to work on my mental health, but I also think maybe an important component of this might be processing what's for me felt like a very traumatic experience and this narrative I have about myself and what is the world like and what I'm going to continue to encounter based on those experiences.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks for taking time to just address that. I know that's a little outside of what we were talking about today.
Yeah.
A couple questions about the study. Just questions about the sample. So how was the sample chosen with regard to where the individual falls on the spectrum regarding age, gender, all of those different things? How did you recruit?
Yeah, so the Interactive Autism Network, unfortunately, is no longer functioning, but at the time, it was just a really convenient way to reach a large number of parents of kids on the spectrum, where the community diagnosis of autism had been kind of validated by the research group already. So it was, in many ways, a convenient sample for just doing initial test on this. But some of the decisions we made around age and language had to do with just wanting to give us the best shot of looking at this measure initially, which is so we looked at 8 to 17, thinking that kids below the age of 8, again, the presentation might be even more different, and we might need to phrase the questions in even a different way for that young age group. And same thing for language level. We included phrase as well as complex communicative speech in this initial study, thinking that that's a good place to start. And we might need to make even more changes or adaptations if we wanted to include children who are unable to verbally communicate in any way. So that's kind of where we started. The sample wasn't perfect. It was kind of a convenience sample. But at the same time, I do think it gave us the opportunity to talk to a large number of parents of kids on the spectrum, and we did see a good variety, honestly, in the different types of stressful experiences that they had seen their children be exposed to, including, you know, a chunk who had maltreatment histories. And then also many others who really had these social exclusion histories as the primary forms of trauma, and then others who were seeing these kind of stressors, particularly related to some features of autism that were seemed to be impacting their children. So I think it's one sample, one step. It had some advantages, but we're going to need a number of other studies with different samples to really fully understand this construct and this tool.
Do you have time for a couple more questions? I can keep
Yeah,
them
I
pretty.
do. I can
This
do
first
one.
one, oh, one more. Okay, so this is about if somebody wanted to access the CASSQ, how would they
Mhm.
get it? How do you do it?
You can email me, and hopefully in the next few weeks, you could go to our website and fill out a request form that you're interested in looking at it or using it for your research, and then we can be in contact with you directly.